So you may or may not know this, but minibus taxis are the only form of transportation in South Africa that currently does not receive a subsidy, right? So the My City is subsidized, the trains get subsidized, your commuter bus services get subsidized like Golden Arrow and Putco, but minibus taxis typically do not. There's a number of reasons why that's not taking place, but I think for as long as they remain not not participating in the main stream of subsidies and organization, there will naturally be conflict. And the trick, of course, then is how that industry came about to be where it is today, arguably one of the most resilient industries in South Africa at the moment, and how it's been able to self-regulate and go about doing its business.
How would you build it? It's episode 18, and Renee, I got you back. How you doing?
Yeah, great, man. Good to be here.
Yeah.
Freezing cold.
Still, the cold front is still whipping us here, and you wouldn't believe it or not, but I guessed Velani, he's also in Cape Town, but you wouldn't see it. You wouldn't say it with that outfit.
I'm definitely in Cape Town.
Thick skin then. Velani, thank you for joining. You are the founder of Lula Loop. Do you want to maybe just tell us like the elevator pitch of Lula Loop?
Yeah, sure. So Lula is a platform that connects businesses and their people to a network of vans to take them from home to work and beyond, really trying to free up time, save money, reduce your carbon footprint. We typically would partner with vehicle owners who have what we call larger vehicles, so 6-seaters up to 22 seats, and match them with recurring bookings on the platform, servicing enterprises. So this could be schools, corporates, medium-sized companies, sports clubs, NGOs, you name it, really to move them from home to work and beyond. Now, the business has obviously scaled since that first concept, and so we've introduced additional services, such as when Bobby and Rainier want to go watch some rugby at the stadium with their squad, they can book one of our 14-seaters. It could be when companies take events, they can book that. It could also be for airport rides and any kind of ad hoc point-to-point trips can all be booked on the platform. So yeah, high level about Lula. We're live in about 5 cities across South Africa, done well over 400,000 bookings, over 1,000 drivers on the platform, and served over 250 companies across South Africa.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you for that. I was actually thinking about it. So there's been themes, Renee, on our podcast. It's like logistics seems to come up quite often. And I think the thing that I'm realizing, and in South Africa, there's like some areas that everyone kind of is struggling with, right? There's those opportunities that are available, and logistics seems to be one of them, Renee. What's your take on kind of the logistics industry and the space that Velani's playing in?
Well, I think it's fascinating because South Africa is quite unique in that context, right? So we've got a massive working force that, due to apartheid, was moved outside of the economic hubs of our country, right? So we've got all of these people living outside of cities, right? And they typically still, to this day, unfortunately, most of them are still lower income people that cannot afford to buy cars. So they need a way to get to and from work. And what I love about Velani, what he's doing is, some of these companies have employees that work late at night, and then the typical taxis or buses that these people normally use don't operate at those times. And getting these people back home is a crucial need for any employer. Like, if their staff are taken care of and they're safe on their way home, it means there's staff retention, there's more happiness of staff, and business can continue. So in this space, of bridging the gap, really, and if it may at the moment just be via transport between, our traditional townships or lesser developed economic centers to the city centers where there's more economic activity, there's this opportunity to do transport either of goods or people. And I think there's so much opportunity in that space. And the more we develop those routes, the more we'll see economic development in these places, which up until now has been underdeveloped. And it's starting to take shape. The township economies are growing slowly, but they are growing. And the more we see services like that, I think the more we'll see that grow.
Brilliant. Yeah, I was thinking, I think it was literally yesterday or the day before I was driving home, and it was a sight for sore. It was like there was a train riding next to my car. I was like, wow, a train.
Wow.
Things are being transported, not on the road. It was
haven't
amazing.
seen any of those in a while.
Yeah. So Velani, I'm actually quite curious. You obviously, like we've just spoken about the opportunities within the logistics space. I want to understand, like, coming from a product manager, you have a business model, you have an idea, you have something that you want to exploit. You want to exploit an opportunity, right? How far away is your current product to where you were when you first started? You just spoke about rugby games, so I'm just curious about where you started and the famous pivot word.
I love that you started with that because, offline, you asked the question, how long have we been going for? And for me as the entrepreneur, my first foray at this thing was 2014. And at the time, we were actually a B2G business model, business to government. And the idea at that point was, how do you take transportation modes that exist, whether it be buses, trains, taxis, cabs, put them on one platform, allow you to track them in real time, and allow you to pay for them. That was the core of what we tried to do for the first 4 years between 2014 and 2018. And that failed. I mean, we had a different kind of approach to the thing, which was, of course, you now need to engage government agencies or functions of the government. So, whether it be the My City bus or the Ria Vaya in Johannesburg or the Gautrain, the whole model then was to target that. And I think for me at that point, when it never worked, whether it be the business model was flawed or that the technology wasn't right for the time, the thing that kept me going was falling in love with the problem rather than falling in love with the solution. And we ran out of money, things didn't work out, and some friends of mine came together, gave me some cash, and said, "Try this thing again." And that's when we flipped from B2G to a B2B2C type model, where we still wanted to solve the same problem, but we said, "Hey, instead of trying to get all the transport modes into one platform and enable them, let's get private shuttle owners, plug them into the platform, and give them more work than what they're currently getting." At that point in time, we thought, well, our substitution effect would be ride hailing services or driving your own car. So, how do we get the cost low to a point where people can make this thing more convenient than public transit, but more affordable than driving your own car? And at that point, I guess 2018 to about late 2019, it was B2B2C with an emphasis on trying to get people to leave their cars at home. But what we quickly realized then is that the cost of having to maintain a ride when they have low bookings wasn't going to be sustainable in a capital scarce environment. And again, after much iteration, COVID, we then just doubled down on B2B, where companies would pay for the ride as opposed to individuals paying per head. And so we've kind of gone through those iterations from B2G to B2B2C to just B2B while still solving the same fundamental problem in a more efficient and convenient way for not just the end user, but for the driver and for the employer in the grand scheme of things. So that's how evolution has evolved.
That's super interesting.
Is there space, Velani, for B2G in this country? I mean, the processes of tender and all this stuff, like, I mean, I get it, right? It's trying to protect the public purse, but ultimately innovation doesn't work that way, right? You come up with an idea and you want to go pitch it to government because it's really going to make an impact. Like where does one start? Is there even a space for innovation to go pitch it to government?
So I think you have to have, I mean, if I zoom in on transportation, you have to have certain things in place. And so one of the main factors that's missing in the South African transport ecosystem is the presence of what we call a central transport authority. So if you've been to London, you've heard of something called TfL, which is Transport for London. If you go to Washington, D.C., you have what they call WMATA, which is the Washington Metropolitan Association of Transport. So basically a central authority that is in charge of regulating, managing, and providing transportation services. What you'll probably see here in, like, let's say Gauteng, is that whatever happens in Pretoria is very different to what happens in Johannesburg. What happens in Ekurhuleni is very different to what happens in Pretoria. Ria Vaya covers Johannesburg, but in Ekurhuleni you have the KTVR bus system, right? Pretoria has I forget what the metro system is called, but it's another type of system, and that's because of the absence of a central transport authority. So if you had a central transport authority, which you could, basically consolidate data, consolidate supply, consolidate routes, you would then be able to be in a stronger position to say, hey guys, I have this application layer that will primarily serve as a channel for acquiring customers and facilitating payments. that can then apply ubiquitously. Until that exists, it's very hard to get to a point and say, hey, I have this idea for transportation. I want to apply to government that can just work. Because even then, the government currently is trying to deal with the issue of consolidating and making transportation seamless. So for right now, it's very, very hard to get that off the ground.
That's so interesting. And offline, Rene asked the question to you as well. And I remember we were talking again offline about Sweep South and Luke Hannemer. He went to a talk, I'll never forget, around the taxi industry. And he came back almost pale in the face because he was just like, the information that he had found out at this meeting just shook him. Anyways, do they talk about the taxi mafia kind of that are running the show? Now, do you think that they're part to play in why we don't have a central government, like you just said, authority that's overlooking it? Like, is there a tug of war happening that's stopping this kind of opportunity from happening?
Look, I think there's political will across not just national government, but provincial government and local government to try and consolidate a lot of the activities. I think the big issue that taxis face, or rather minibus taxis face in South Africa, is primarily around subsidies, right? So you may or may not know this, but minibus taxis are the only form of transportation in South Africa that currently does not receive a subsidy, right? So the My City is subsidized, the trains get subsidized, your commuter bus services get subsidized like Golden Arrow and Putco, but minibus taxis typically do not. There's a number of reasons why that's not taking place, but I think for as long as they remain not not participating in the main stream of subsidies and organization, there will naturally be conflict. And the trick, of course, then is how that industry came about to be where it is today, arguably one of the most resilient industries in South Africa at the moment, and how it's been able to self-regulate and go about doing its business. So I think the will is there. It's just a case of what can be done between all stakeholders to make sure that people get treated with equality and justice.
That's very interesting, Velani. And actually, I mean, to your point, I mean, they probably transport the majority of people in South Africa, right? And yet they're not subsidized, which I think is an important consideration. And I think also, if we want to dive into the history books, there was a time in South Africa where government didn't supply transport services. And these people stepped up and started building businesses to actually, deliver a service, yes, and make money from it, but actually help these people get to work and back. So there's some history and background there, which I think is a delicate thing to navigate. But on the taxi industry, I mean, there must be tons of business opportunity in and around what's happening in the taxi space. Like I've forever heard about people trying to operate like these advertising things and Wi-Fi's and taxis and I don't know what else. I must be honest. I grew up privileged, so I haven't spent a lot of time in taxis. Velani, are there opportunities? Like if any hustlers are listening in on this, like what opportunities are there in this taxi space? Like what can people get into? What have you seen work, or what can people look into if they want to build a business in this space?
Yeah, so I think maybe as I answer that, just to qualify, so as a business, we don't operate in the same line of work as the taxi industry, but we are to some extent complementary to them, in the sense that when we operate in times where their vehicles aren't moving, we could possibly get them on board and fulfill some of the rides, not just for home to work activity, but also for private charter services, tours, etc. So just very important to clarify that we do not operate in line with them. We maybe would be complementary. The second thing on the industry is that, look, it moves 17 million people a year, a day across South Africa. It generates over 90 billion rand worth of revenue. So there is a lot of space that you can play, and not just on the consumer facing side, but also on the supply side, right? So things like parts, financing services, advertising, which is a big one, ways to make the processes more efficient for them. There's a lot that can be done, but you just have to have the capital, the resilience, and the patience to obviously navigate arguably one of the most lucrative industries in South Africa.
Yeah,
Sure.
and that's where SA Taxi obviously plays a big role. I think 60% of all taxis are financed through them. Listed company. So yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, I think they, of the 250,000 taxis on the road, they probably finance about 28 to 30,000, so just over 11%.
Oh, okay, cool. No, I thought
Yeah,
it was
so
more.
I mean, the industry is very cash focused.
Mhm.
Guys who make it in that industry typically have done the hard yards earlier on and tried to buy the vehicles cash.
Mm.
Of course, I mean, you've probably seen what happened with Transaction Capital, the mother company that owns
Yeah.
SAT, led to like share price dropping, and so a whole kind of ripple effect on why that has happened.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about you talking about having all this cash on hand. Rene, you were quite stoked when PayShop came into the fold. Could you see you guys partnering with a PayShop? Do you think the cash side of this thing is an opportunity there, like to not go cash, or do they want to be in the cash?
In terms of Lula's core business,
Lula, yeah, specifically.
yeah. So I think for us, look, we typically operate in a model where the enterprise pays us.
Of course.
So we don't
Yeah.
really need individuals to be funding the rides beforehand. I mean, we do have a strategy for that in the future. I mean, for example, now when I go to meetings, I can book on the Lula app myself without having the company pay. We use Peach Payments to process payments. So we don't really have any issues around collecting payment. The only core issue right now for us as a business is the working capital day. So some corporates pay 60 days, some take 90 days, some 40 days. So that's
90 days on statement.
yeah, 90 days of statement. I mean, one bid we went for was
Like half
100.
a year later, you get your money.
Yeah, one company was 150 days. I remember that bid. I was like, this is insane.
Listen, with the current world inflation we're facing, that's like you have to overcharge by 10% just to make sure you break even.
Oh
Correct.
gosh,
Correct.
that's hectic. All right, Velani. So, like, I think what we like to talk about here is the startup scene and kind of helping people that have that idea get it off the ground. Everyone says just start. The amount of times you double click on a YouTube video or something, it's like just start. But in South Africa, we know that it's not that easy, and I think for a large amount of South Africans that are potentially startup focused, they're kind of driven to be one, that fear of failure is just a bit hectic. So what's been your experience of like saying, okay, cool, or what would your advice be to somebody else that's that's been told just start, but they've got that fear of failure and they've got a family to support, so it's not that easy?
Yeah, so I think to qualify, when I started Lula, I was in my final year of undergrad. So I was young, I was naive, I was optimistic about everything, and I also had the option to keep studying, which I did whilst concurrently trying to build this business. I also had the privilege of being able to live with my parents, and all of that gave me enough buffer to weather the initial storm of figuring things out. Um, and in all honesty, I think it took a little bit longer than I would have liked. But having gone through some accelerator programs now, I think I have a lot more wisdom on how much time I should be spending on focusing on particular things. So I think maybe the first thing I would say is if you have an idea, just write it down, get a business model canvas, put that idea into paper, and just constantly start iterating on what you're trying to solve, falling in love with the problem rather than the solution, and speaking to as many potential customers as possible. This could be a sake of, let's say you wanted to start an app to split payments between your friends whenever you go to pay a bill, right? Every single time you're out at a restaurant or you're out partying, just speak to a couple of guys next to you, like, hey man, I see you guys are about to pay your bill. Can I just ask, like, how would you like do this a lot easier? What would be a convenient way? Just and always like walk around. One of the things I do is carry these little books everywhere I go, just constantly making notes, and you'll get to a point where eventually things will begin to make sense. But again, the first thing is like put the idea on paper, speak to potential customers, and just figure it out as it goes. I would say, look, try to take as many calculated risks as possible. I think if I started my business 2 or 3 years later, I probably would not have started. I think there is a lot of risk when you have to consider other people or other implications that I did not have when I was much younger. So yeah, get started, try get around communities of people, whether it be accelerators or incubators, who can help you think about problems and also give you access to people who are willing to solve problems with you. So that's how I would do it.
Yeah, Renier, what's your thought on that? I mean, I know as you get older, it gets a little bit more tougher to take that leap of starting something. I mean, what's your theme that you've seen?
Well, I think that's one of the biggest challenges in South Africa, right? So if in Europe or America, when you ask someone a question like this, they go, "Oh yeah, you just use some of that family wealth to fund yourself for the next 6 to 12 months and get it off the ground." And they can't believe that we can't do that. It's like, well, not only can't we not do that, most South Africans, a lot of South Africans are on the back foot either through study debt or black tax is a real thing. Like they have to send money back home. So, you're confronted with taking a job at corporate for 25,000 Rand or whatever the case may be, and being able to send 5,000 Rand a month back home, or, take a startup job with, maybe no income. And then, if you're the only provider in a family, how on earth do you make a decision to go, I'm not going to help my family out when there's an opportunity to actually get a job and earn an income? So that is a massive thing that we need to overcome. Like it might be generational, but we're not really going to see the entrepreneurial spirit take off unless we solve that issue, which is we need to be creating wealth as South Africans, generational wealth, so that those that come behind after us, they've got a foundation at which they can launch. I remember spending some time in Sweden, and you speak to people that finish their studies, and I mean, they're millionaires. Like their families just give them money and give them property, and they go, well, do whatever you love to do in life. They're not confronted with, I've got this amount of money that I need to get before I can choose what I want to do with my life. Like, and I think, from a larger South African perspective, I'd love our nation to get to a place where, a lot of people have that freedom to actually pursue what they're passionate about, and they're not constrained with financial burdens of, what they need to care for a family or family member, or pay off debt, or whatever the case may be. And that's something that I think we can all aspire to building. So until we see that, I don't see us having a lot more entrepreneurs. But to Velani's point, like if you're young, you have less expenses. I think something that I've seen actually, which is amazing. You work with some of these young founders, they graduate, but they amount, the little bit of money that they survive on monthly is quite impressive. Like I don't know how you do that, and they seem to operate from that place, and they get a bit of traction, and then the guys from Air Student come to mind. I incubated them as part of the French South African Tech Labs, and they just hustled as students, similar to what Velani did at UCT. And now they've built a business out of it. They raised a bit of money, and they're getting some good traction. I saw them on SABC yesterday, and they're making some moves. So and now the whole economics of the thing just makes a bit more sense, because they don't have to earn massive amount of salaries, so they don't have to raise a lot of money. So it makes sense. So it gets harder when you're older, which is unfortunate, because if you're older, you're more wiser and you can make better business decisions. So yeah, it is tough in South Africa, that's for sure.
I'd probably add to that. Renier mentioned either working at corporate or starting a company, but there's actually a midpoint to that, which is actually working at a startup. And working at a startup has such enormous propensity to accelerate your career, in the sense that you are so close to the fire as an employee of a startup that you're feeling the heat that you would probably never feel sitting at Nedbank or Investec or Discovery. With all
the heat or the explosion, right?
Yeah. Right? Like if salaries aren't going to be paid at the end of the month, you quickly find out about that very quickly, right? And you kind of get told about, like, what is the reason why salaries may not be paid? What do we have to do together as a collective to try and make sure that we don't find ourselves in this position? So being able to see that firsthand and understand decision-making processes, where revenue comes from, what is the cost base, what are we relying on, all of that can actually help you accelerate your career in terms of being, firstly, accountable, responsible, and seeing the bigger picture that a corporate job can't get. So I would really encourage anyone who's maybe thinking of starting a startup, but is maybe too scared, doesn't have the resources, go join like a seed stage company, or a Series A or a Series B. Companies like Yoko, Luno, Mama Money, Lula, all of us, join us, because we will put you close to the fire, and you'll learn. because no 2 days are the same. And that's what you'll go through even as a founder
100%.
prior to getting that off the ground.
No,
I love
can't
that,
agree with you
Velani. And
more.
actually, there's a big part in the US. That's how a lot of startups start, right? People go, cool, I want to learn, I want to do a startup. I just don't have my idea right. Not sure how to do it. I want to learn a bit more. Go to startup university, go work for a startup. And that's
Yeah.
where you learn. You work there for 3 to 5 years. Maybe you get some equity. Maybe you get a bit of an exit, lays a foundation for you. And that foundation, could just buy you the runway to actually get going. Or actually starting a startup, raising funding, but not having to take a massive salary or even a salary, which could result in you getting a big share of equity and, setting the whole thing up for a win. So I love that. Yeah, we need to get more. We need to get the best people to, instead of working for corporate, come and work for startups in South Africa.
Yeah.
That's what we need to get going.
I love that. I think it's so bloody true. The amount that I learned when I was working in startups, I've always worked in startups. Unfortunately, I'm not at the moment, but I miss being, like you just said, like close to the fire, like close to, like you finance, there's their door. Where's that? It's right there. And that person's actually wearing 3 hats. So they have like a lot of context for you to go, or you the one with all the context, and you actually get to start managing people very quickly and start understanding what it'd be like to be a CEO. So I love that. I think it's so true. We need to build up like some sort of an ecosystem for people to get their startup wings or something. Yeah.
We can take the route of the Accountants Association, and just force, what is that? It's almost like slave labor. When you want to become a CA, you have to work for 3 years for almost no pay.
Yeah.
And then everybody just sits there as if it's acceptable. Like, we should do that for startup, but just not the slave labor part.
Yeah. So Velani, I know you talk a lot about being in a community. What are you feeling from other founders when you talk to them? Do they talk similarly to what you're saying? What's their experience?
Well, it depends, right? Because I think, if you're a pre-seed / idea stage founder versus a seed stage founder who's got his idea and made it into a product and has some traction versus a Series A, Series B growth stage founder, you had very different tiers of, let's call it, reality, right? So an idea stage founder has a lot of enthusiasm and the world is the oyster and they can do it, and that's great. But the seed stage founder is the one who's really, let's call it, doing the hard yards now. And then the growth stage founder has learned quite a lot of lessons, still learning actively, but really knows, let's call it, to see the tree from the wood. And what I've learned from engaging with all those communities is that each one serves as a stepping stone to your next level. So if I had to start a company from scratch right now in my idea phase, I would hang out at all the little accelerated programs, incubation hubs, and just bounce ideas, get a sense of where everyone's at to figure out like, what are people doing to get to their next step. But I would equally keep in touch with the founder who is one stage ahead of me. So when I was in my seed stage, one of the founders I, had great privilege of speaking with extensively was firstly Aisha from Sweep South,
Nice.
Ngisa from Yoko. And the little minutes I would spend talking with them would illuminate my eyes so much that it would not just give me the confidence to try a lot better, but give me a lot more peace in understanding what I'm going through. So, for example, Lisa told me about, it's like, hey man, like, have you ever considered just like using your software to manage existing transport providers? And this was during COVID. I was like, I've never thought about that. We launched a SaaS product. It's the most profitable line item in our income statement.
Love it.
Lungisa literally just told me, like, you would kill it if you did that. And I did it. Like, I remember talking with Aisha and she was like, yo, man, you should consider A, B, C, D about fundraising. Don't look at a price round to like a convertible. I did that. We raised millions of dollars off that insight. And I've learned that, talking to guys who are at your same stage may be a case of the blind leading the blind in some cases. But if you talk to guys who are just one stage above you, you save so much time and you get so much insight. So just again, being part of communities where founders are sharing little nuggets of notes and being able to articulate things very clearly has really, really saved me a lot of time and energy. And of course, being humble enough to take the advice, because I think a lot of times like, oh, you're a founder, you're so cool. There's that mistake that people think that you're a know-it-all. Actually, the most humble people are the ones who succeed the most. If you think your idea, everyone has done it, like no one has done it before, rude awakening is coming. So just be humble and speak with people and get their advice.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And like just thinking, Renee, about Specno and their event, getting all the founders den together and having those conversations and just sparking up that conversation and learning from each other seems to be such an important part of being a founder.
Yeah, and I think I love what Velani says, because if you really think about it, it goes two ways, right? It goes, if you're building something, look for someone that's 1 or 2 steps ahead of you, right? But it also applies to every single person out there. Like, there's always someone that's 1 or 2 steps behind you in whatever you're doing, right? So, I'd love more people to share what they learn, like product owners to share on LinkedIn stuff they learn, like people building, businesses, all kinds of disciplines, right? We can all learn from other people, because in certain places I might be 2 steps ahead of someone else, but they might be 2 steps ahead in another discipline, which could actually help me in what I'm doing. So, I want to encourage more people to share and share what they're learning, because there's always, your audience is always actually the people 1 to 2 steps behind you. And that's so powerful. And coming back to the South African startup community, how can we get this thing going? Perhaps if more people share and more people reach out and try and learn from people 2 steps ahead from them, then we can grow all of this faster and make progress faster.
Yeah. So Velani, I just want to kind of touch on Lula again. You say you've been around since 2014. It's 2023, so we'll almost be hitting the 10 mark. That's quite something. First of all, congratulations. But something that really resonated with me, I don't know if we spoke about it online or not, but you said how different Pretoria is to Joburg, is to Durban, is to Gqeberha, to Cape Town, right? Like everything is different, right? So now you've got the SaaS thing and you said, okay, cool, now I can scale because I have this technology. But my time at Sweep South, we also learned very quickly how different these cities were. So how do you think that you can use this technology to scale now in South Africa to more cities and then potentially across Africa?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is probably to, let's call it, interrogate the question about scaling. And it always sounds sexy to scale a company as a function of having scalable money available. Now, scalable money is typically money that funds growth. And growth is no longer sexy in the current capital markets as profitability is sexy. And so at this current juncture, we really have to focus on getting the fundamentals right and seeing where those fundamentals can be applied either within your city, within your country, before you look at other nations or other cities outside. And why I mention this is because one of my favorite proverbs is from Abraham Lincoln, who said, if I had 8 hours to cut down a tree, I'd spend the first 6 hours sharpening my axe. And very rarely do founders get into a business or start a company with the view of sharpening their axe, no matter how long it takes, and then scaling it out. Most of the times we understand that, okay, cool, like we start an idea, we want to scale into this many cities. But if you're scaling so fast and your foundations are shaky, it's going to just lead to a very, very dangerous implosion. So why I mention this is because I think every single company needs to fall in love with its problem, understand the nuances, work on the risks around that, and try build its defensibility, and then try replicate that in a sustainable way in different cities. So, for example, our business in Johannesburg doesn't have as many rides as our business in Cape Town, but the value of each ride is much larger, right? It's much larger because Joburg is a much more sparse city. You have a lot more companies there that are willing to pay top dollar for a reliable and premium service. So in Cape Town, we have what we call our eco vans, which are like your six-seater Ertigas being booked very often. Whereas in Gauteng, we have a huge demand for things like your Mercedes V-Class, et cetera, because companies want premium. And understanding that nuance then says, okay, if I'm going to now leave the cities in South Africa and set up something in Nairobi, Kenya, or Dar es Salaam, or Kampala, Uganda, I can't take everything I've learned in South Africa and then just copy and paste it. I need to sit and say, what have been the underlying unit economics for this model being a success in South Africa? What of these assumptions hold true in these various cities? How many of these things can be replicated? How many of these things are defendable in that market? And how many of these things will make a difference in the lives of people there? then try implement it, as opposed to just saying, hey, let's scale, right? Like we need to just get the fundamentals right before we try scale, because unfortunately, capital is not funding growth anymore. Capital is funding sustainable businesses that are either profitable on a very direct path to profitability.
Jeez, I love that so much, Rene. It kind of always what you talk about, right? And I like what you said earlier, Velani, was it's no longer about growth, but it's about profitability. And I think it speaks to where we are globally, with the financial state of things, interest rates and stuff is where they are. Rene, what's your last takes before we wrap up?
No, the time for startup theater is over. The rubber is hitting the road now, and it's all about building businesses that can generate value for its shareholders. And that's what startups is ultimately about, right? We can sometimes get so caught up in all this startup stuff like pitching and decks and fundraising and all of it. At the end of the day, you're building a business that's supposed to bring forth returns to its investors, right? Whether that's through dividend or a large exit or both. That's the objective, and sometimes that gets lost by the wayside. So love that, and looking at that's probably one of the positives we can take out of an economic downturn, right? It's going to force everybody to think that way, and when we get out on the other side, then people will be thankful for what they learn in the season. So that's encouraging. And yeah, just one thing from my side, Velani, like I think there's a bit of overlap with what Lula is doing and Uber. What do you see the future of Uber? I mean, they're having challenges everywhere with localization and fights with drivers and all of those things.
Yeah.
Will they be able to solve that, or are they just hanging on for driverless vehicles and then just swapping everybody out with a driverless vehicle?
That's a great question. Look, I think the first thing is I admire Uber for what they've achieved. As a starting point, they've raised billions and billions of dollars in capital, but they also did it in a world that was very different to what we have right now. So, I mean, Uber really was founded in 2009, which is 14 odd years ago.
Sure. Yeah.
Very few people realize that's how long ago Uber's been going.
Still not making money.
Yeah. I mean, but the truth is, where Uber is, again, I'm not an expert. I don't speak on behalf of them, but where they are moving now is the delivery, right? The delivery business is what's really putting the numbers for them. They seem to want to invest heavily in like ghost stores. They really are the platform for moving goods above people rather than
Last mile as a service.
Exactly, and I think that's really where they're moving from what I've seen. Of course, I don't pretend to be on the inside. And what I would say from their end is probably, I think because they had spent so much money scaling the ride-hailing business across the world, it's kind of too late to claw back on that. Because, yeah, I mean, they've just spent billions in trying to build that. And why they lose in a lot of markets is because of that localization aspect. In China, they lost out to Didi. In London, they're currently losing out to Bolt. In other African cities where there is a local competitor, they're typically losing to them. And they're maybe now in a position where they have to either acquire their competitor to kind of maintain market share without investing heavily in subsidizing drivers. So I think their future really is leaning towards the logistics side as opposed to passenger mobility. But that'll all be up to them to decide, and we'll see how the future holds for them. But again, it's primarily on the moving of goods rather than people.
Sure. That's quite an interesting pivot. Yeah. Makes sense. But yeah, cool. Great insights, Velani. Thank you so much for joining. It's been a priceless episode, and it was really great having you on. And yeah, wishing you all the best for the next couple of years taking on Uber, eh?
That fight's already won.
Appreciate your time, guys. Have a good one.
Yeah, thanks so much, man. Cheers.
Thanks, Velani. All the best. Ciao.
Brilliant.